Over the coming weeks, I'll be releasing a few highlight videos from our first season of Open Source in Business. This episode is on the importance of trademark and branding for open source companies and open source projects. In our first episode, I spoke to Adam Jacob and Scott McCarthy about how to resolve the tension between community brand, product brand, and company brand. And this is what Adam had to say.
I think that's a great question. I think first off, if you're selling a product, you must own the brand, full stop, 100%, end of story. Mm-hmm. There is no conversation. There's no version of the universe where you sell a product, but you don't own the brand. That's insane, and it can't work. So, so that's just, so we just start there. So like, I'll use Chef as an example. I always owned Chef. In the very beginning, Adam Jacob, owned that software and owned its trademark and owned the thing. And then I started a company called Opscode. Then Opscode owned that trademark. And like, there was never a community version of Chef where that mark was in the world and didn't come with my largesse. Do you know what I mean? Like, the world got it because I let them have it. But it was never like there was a community around Chef, and that community recognized Chef as itself. And I'm not saying it didn't have ownership over the experience or over that thing. Absolutely, we did. And it was thousands of people, and it was one of the greatest things I've ever been part of in my entire life. It was beautiful. It's still beautiful. It's glorious. But that brand belongs to Chef. It always belonged to Chef. And when we were an open core business, we allowed that conflation to happen because we believed that it was better for conversion. That people believed that there was an open source distribution of Chef that you could get for no money was part of the conversion funnel to the paid versions of Chef that I was trying to sell you, sort of in the open core model. When we shifted more to the free software product model, more Red Hat's model, all of that went away, but at one exception. Now there wasn't a version of Chef anymore that was distributed free of my terms. So in order to get Chef, you had to pay me for it at some point. Whereas before, I would both make the software and I would give it to you for free, right? And now I make the software, but I don't necessarily give it to you for free. Now there's another open source project that's called Sync. Sync is downstream of Chef, stands for Sync is not Chef. And they produce their own builds. You can go download Sync, right? And they're a delightful group of people. But that's the first time ever in the history of Chef's entire life that somebody who didn't work at Chef Inc. could make a build. And I just want to which the delta there in its community management is just mind-blowingly big, right? And so I would argue it's a much healthier thing now that there are two, because there's actually a reasonable alternative now in a way that there never was before. You were always sort of beholden to me. Now, nobody likes it when you were getting something for free and now you can't. So there were people who were mad because they were like, oh man, you used to drop it off at my house and now you don't. And I'm like, well, yeah. But ultimately I think that is the way you need to think about how you manage it, because as a product owner, you must own the brand. If you don't have a product. And once you decide you're going to own the brand, then the question is, under what terms can people interact with it? It's a product. How can they buy it? And it's usually better if it's separate, but I think it doesn't have to be separate, right? What it has to be is yours.
In the last episode of Season 1, Jason Kridner of the Beagleboard project also mentioned Trademark as a good way to protect your brand when commercializing an open source product.
I think there's a lot more interesting ways to try to protect your intellectual property and the things that you're doing differently than to try to hide the design files, right? That's probably not how most people are differentiating. Like intellectual property, of course, you've got copyright, you've got trademark, and you've got patents, and all that stuff is may or may not be useful depending on what you're trying to do, because there's always going to be other people out there doing interesting things, but probably nobody doing exactly what you're trying to do. And I think that your brand matters a whole lot, and that for Beagleboard, it's all about our trademark, right? That's the valuable part. Adafruit produces a certain experience for people that go and shop on adafruit.com. And, she doesn't just sell her product, she sells a lot of people's products, but they get an experience when they go to, adafruit.com that they're going to be able to go and solve certain problems or go and achieve certain things, learn certain things, build certain things. And I think that that's probably the more valuable thing to protect than what the design files are.
Yeah. When I spoke to John Lilly, former CEO of the Mozilla Corporation, I also asked him about the history of the Mozilla Firefox trademark, and in particular about the Iceweasel project that was launched by Debian at the time. I wanted to know whether the success of Firefox depended on strong trademark protection as a consumer brand. How important was it for Firefox, the trademark, to be have a pretty strong protection in terms of its success?
So, well, when you say almost everyone will remember the dispute you guys had with Debian and
my audience,
it's almost maybe almost all of your friends will, but I kind of forgot about it. So it's a very nerd specific topic. But but what you note is right, which is open source has always been great about copyright law and always been really mute about what to do about trademarks. And it's because it's a different form of law. Trademark was always for consumers. So it's like, how are you sure that when you go to the store and you buy a can of Coca-Cola on the shelf, it's real Coca-Cola? And so the government gives you the right to assert trademark to keep other people, so for consumer safety, basically consumer surety. And Mitchell, I don't know if people know this, but Mitchell is a lawyer, so she understood this stuff from the jump, and she understood that when people are going to be using this thing to get their internet and do their banking and their school and everything on, it had to be secure, and normal people, not server operators, not developers, normal people had to have faith that it was really actual Firefox. And so we were always strong trademark. And we took a lot of heat from that in the open source community. So people said, well, we're not free software in the Richard Stallman tradition or whatever, which was true. We were asserting rights and we were saying, you can do this, you can't do this, which, some libertarians don't love. But we felt like it was requirement for consumers to be able to use to be useful to consumers at all. And so that was the right decision. It made people mad. So it meant they couldn't use the logo or the trademark or whatever. And we just had to take it. It was, I don't think there was any question that it's the right thing to do. I think that it still probably makes people mad today.
I have to say, from a personal point of view, I've never seen any conflict between being free software and having strong trademark protections. I like you said, I see them as orthogonal. So I don't think that affects the freedom or not of the software.
Yeah. I think different people have different views on this, and I don't care what the term is. I just think as a practical matter, if I'm not sure what Firefox is, then I don't really want to use it.
Okay. In episode 2 of the first season, I spoke to Stephen O'Grady of RedMonk about how open source vendors can compete with hosted offerings in large public clouds. And Stephen once again brought up the value of building a brand and being the originator of a project as being valuable to customers.
Well, I think there's a couple things. So first of all, typically, for Amazon or for Google or for Microsoft or whomever, right, to offer the project, that means they're seeing a ton of demand, right? Because they don't just pick up sort of tiny new projects that don't have any users. There's nothing in it for them. So at the time when you begin competing with them, that means that you are a sort of widespread project. You have achieved a critical mass, right? So you are by definition sort of not really, you're the little guy relative to Amazon, or whomever, of course, but you're not a little guy anymore. By definition, you're a sort of big entity in and of yourself. So there's a couple of different ways to look at this, right? Sort of one way is that, and this is sort of one of the things that we've seen a bunch of the commercial suppliers, typically on the database side, have sort of said, all right, we're going to release licenses which essentially behave in most respects like open source licenses, but it's explicitly and expressly forbid players like the cloud players from using them, right? So that's one way to do it. You can basically say, all right, I'm going to, essentially, try to realize some of the benefits of open source, meaning that the source itself is available. People can sort of look at it, potentially contribute fixes and so on, although that becomes sort of fraught. But I don't want to compete with Amazon, right? I don't want Amazon or whomever to pick up my stuff and run with it. So
this is
that's
kind of a commons clause or
commons clause
the newer licenses.
Yep. Commons clause. I mean, you've seen a whole bunch of people have done this. Confluent, Mongo, Timescale DB, sort of list goes on and on and on, right? And even sort of prior to them, Cockroach took this approach. MariaDB took this approach. So there's a whole bunch of people sort of have gone down this route. Sort of intriguingly, most of them are database providers, but that's a much longer conversation. We probably don't have time for here. Anyhow, the point is that, this is essentially all right, I sort of want a firewall between, sort of this project and, any potential competition from Amazon or whomever. So, that is an approach. It's an approach that, look, if people do it right, as long as they don't blur the lines between the commercial license and the open source license, then fine, right? So be it. If people are sort of willing to be transparent and just say, hey, this is not open source, but it has some of the same attributes, that's not a major concern, at least as far as I'm concerned. There are the commons clause that you mentioned in particular. My issue with that was that, in my opinion, that sort of intentionally and deliberately blurred the lines, right? So in other words, it was essentially a writer on an open source license that rendered the open source license not open source effectively, right? So it was BSD plus, commons clause, or, whatever it might be, Apache plus commons clause. And as soon as you attach that, the open source license mentioned up front is no longer relevant, right? Because the terms are not open source. So that was that to me crossed a bright line in terms of, hey, we should have a clear delineation between what is and is not open source. Mm-hmm. Anyhow, the sort of bigger question to me is, of the people who are not in that camp, right? Of the people who have not taken that approach, which is most vendors who are not in the database space, sort of why is that? And sort of what is the sort of thinking? And the question to me is, like, if you are one of these providers thinking about taking that essentially exclusionary approach, sort of question number one is, does it work, right? And the answer is probably not, in the sense that, you take Mongo as an example. Mongo sort of transitioned from the AGPL, which is a very restrictive license, from a cloud provider standpoint, introduced a new license, the SSPL. And that license is not regarded as open source, not sanctioned by the OSI. And, so they did this, and what was it, 3 months, I believe, afterwards, Amazon came out with its document DB service, which cloned the MongoDB API. And, a whole bunch of people said, well, hey, this is, proof that this license protected, Mongo, when in fact, that project development on the Amazon side had been underway for well over a year, right? So the license had nothing to do with, Amazon's sort of decision there. And more importantly, they're able to introduce a compatible service, regardless of the source code, right? So essentially what Amazon is saying there is that the API is essentially what's valuable, not necessarily the source code implementation behind it. So that's point one. Point two is that there are, sort of recognizable and provable benefits for folks that do have, sort of instantiations spun up by the cloud provider, right? On the one hand, look, nobody in their right mind wants to compete with, somebody like an Amazon or Google and so on, because they're large, they're well capitalized, and so on. But the flip side of that is that there are a ton of databases on the market, right, in any category that you pick. And one of the hyperscale providers coming along and saying, hey, I'm going to support this one, as we discussed previously, means that there are a lot of users of that, right? So in other words, let's say I'm in the market for a document database, and I have a bunch of different options. And now I can pick between, these ones that are smaller, don't see much usage, and one that is backed by both Mongo and Amazon and Microsoft, with their Cosmos DB product, right? That becomes a pretty easy decision. In terms of, oh, hey, this is the one that has the, clearly the most traction. This is the one that the market is agreeing on. So, to some degree, the sort of the spinning up of a competitive product from one of these cloud providers is nothing more than market validation. And then the question becomes, if you are sort of the database provider, are you better at developing your database than one of the cloud providers? And the answer, probably in most cases, is yes. So anyhow, there are debates. I go back and forth with this, with vendors all the time. We have let's call them robust and spirited dialogues, in which they will sort of explain all the ways I'm wrong, and how this is the only path for them, and so on. Personally, I just don't see it. I think that there are absolute ways to compete. Using just your standard license. Moving forward.
In our next highlight video, we'll look at how open source software has become a key component of the software supply chain for the entire industry. See you then.